hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Piyush and this is day 33 in CK 2024 series. And today we have a very special guest with us, none other than Abhishek Virmala. Of course, this name do not need any introduction. If you are someone who has been following YouTube for their primary learning resource for DevOps, cloud, or anything related to that, you already be familiar with Abhishek Virmala's channel and like the great human being that he is. So welcome Abhishek, welcome to my channel. And how are you doing today?
Thank you so much, Piyush, for the kind words. And I have been following this series. I saw a couple of episodes in this series. Honestly, you're doing great work. 40 days of Kubernetes playlist is the need of the hour. And whoever is watching the series, I'm sure by the end of this series, they will be able to crack the CK certification and your goal will be met. So, once again, it's my pleasure to be here. So, yeah, let's see what is Ingress. And
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Abhishek. Thank you for the amazing words. So yes, so I mean the reason why we are doing this, because it's been a long time that we did any collaboration together, and we were like I was looking into this topic, and I thought who would be the best person to explain this to my viewer, and then your name came to my mind, and thank you for kindly accepting the invite and taking out time from your schedule, and uh, having spare that time and speaking to our audience. So thank you so much, and I'm so excited for this video, and I'm sure everyone will be.
thank you, Pesh. Yeah, let's proceed to the whiteboard
All right.
and
Okay.
let's see. Let's start this topic. I mean, see, a lot of times people get confused even when I talk to some of the experts in the industry. They get confused with this topic, ingress and ingress controller. In today's video, let's try to understand this in as simple way as possible. So let's start with why ingress. So by now, Piyush might have explained in your Kubernetes cluster, when you deploy a application as a pod, you might be using a deployment, you might be using a stateful set or a daemon set. When you have a pod deploy in your Kubernetes cluster, obviously it can be accessed within your Kubernetes cluster, but not from outside of your Kubernetes cluster. And while explaining this, Piyush also covered the concept of services. So, services primarily act for two things. One is it can also help with the load balancing of your Kubernetes pods service identification. And the second thing, when you create service of type node port or service of type load balancer, so this service can also help you in exposing your application to the external world. So when you have your application, the whole purpose of developing the application and writing the application is to enable the access to your applications to your customers. And quite obviously, your customers are sitting outside your Kubernetes cluster. So either you can create service of type node port or load balancer. But node port, usually your Kubernetes nodes will only be accessible within your organization. So it's not a preferred choice if you want to expose it to the customers who are in the external world. So your obvious choice is service of type load balancer. But this service of type load balancer will come up with some disadvantages. Before we understand what is ingress, it is important to understand the background. That's why I'm explaining this. Now, the service of type load balancer, one is it is dependent on your cloud provider, right? What this service of type load balancer does, it will ask your cloud provider to create a load balancer for your service where the load balancer is available in the public private subnet. If you take Amazon as an example, where AWS. So when you create service of type load balancer, what AWS will do, or what your EKS cluster or your Kubernetes cluster will do, it will create a ALB for you, where the ALB is situated in the public private subnet. So your customers can access the ALB, and through the ALB your application will be accessed, which is a quite common scenario. But here it is dependent on your cloud provider. That means, assume you are running your Kubernetes cluster on a cloud provider which does not support this through the cloud control manager, the component of Kubernetes. Then your service of type load balancer will not work. Second thing is, this is a costly or expensive approach, because if you want to expose, let's say, 10 services or 10 applications, then every time you create a service of type load balancer, AWS or any cloud provider will be charging you for each load balancer that you create. You might be thinking that it's not a huge expense for your organization, but imagine when your organizations have multiple services which are running 24 by 7, then the cloud billing will be too high. So these are two major disadvantages of why. Of course, security is another thing. You don't have too much control on the load balancer type this cloud provider is creating for you. Let's say I don't want to use ALB, instead I want to use Nginx. This does not happen when you create service of type load balancer. Or let's say I want to use F5, I want to use Cisco, Palo Alto. This is not possible, because when you create a service of type load balancer, you are very much restricted to your cloud provider, and you only get the load balancing and security capabilities that your service provider provides you. So these are the three major disadvantages. One is very closely tied to your cloud provider. It is a costly and expensive affair. And next thing is the security capabilities, because you have to use what is provided to you. Now you might ask, Abhishek, okay, you have explained all this. What is the alternative? So this is where Ingress comes into picture. So Ingress not only solves the problem that I have explained. If any of you are coming from the world of virtual machines, physical servers, or hypervisors, you know that when we used to deploy the applications, let's take a simple virtual machine. We are going 10 years back, where Kubernetes did not exist. If you take a simple virtual machine or a physical server and deploy an application on it, you have created a Tomcat server or anything and deployed your application on this virtual machine, you can add lot of capabilities to it, such as you can add load balancing, you can prevent this application using API gateways, where you can add a lot of security capabilities like denial of service, DDoS attack. You can whitelist a certain IP addresses. You can blacklist a certain IP addresses. You can add web application firewall. Multiple things you can add to this application that is deployed on your virtual machine, which is again lagging in the world of Kubernetes. Now, who is going to address this problem? Ingress is introduced to solve the exact problem. Now, Piyush, any questions till this point?
No, Abhishek, I guess we are going really good with a good pace, and you have explained everything beautifully. I'm sure everyone will be able to understand all the basics of Ingress, why we need it, and what exactly it is, why do we use it. And still, if you have any question, comment down below and we'll try to answer. But Abhishek, I guess we are good to
Perfect.
continue. Thank
Now,
you.
because
Yeah.
we learned why Ingress, let's go to what is Ingress. In simple terminology, if you are coming from networking background, you might already know, but ingress is a term in networking, which means the traffic that is coming to your application, to your cluster, whatever it is. So ingress is basically the inward traffic that is coming to your application or your Kubernetes cluster. And to implement the concept of ingress, so there are few things that you need to understand. One is the ingress resource in Kubernetes itself. Second is ingress controller. Third is load balancer. Let's take a scenario to understand this. As a DevOps engineer, I want to implement the load balancing capability to the pods that I have deployed on my Kubernetes cluster, and also enable ingress where I want to use Nginx. Now, if you take the traditional Nginx load balancer that is available in the world of virtual machines, and if you try to deploy this, it is not possible because you are in a Kubernetes cluster. And if you take the load balancer and if you try to deploy to it, how will you keep updating the load balancer, right? In Kubernetes, your pods will increase in the number. You might have new applications, you might have new deployments, you might have new services. So it is not that flexible to every time update the load balancer. It can be Nginx or any other load balancer. So that's why what we do as a DevOps engineers, we will write a ingress resource in the declarative approach, that is the YAML files. And who reads this ingress resource? Your ingress controller, which is a Kubernetes controller. And who writes this Kubernetes controllers? The load balancing companies. If Nginx is the load balancing company, then Nginx will develop this Kubernetes controller. And as a DevOps engineer, you will just deploy this Kubernetes controller. It can be through Helm charts or it can be through plain Kubernetes manifest. So you deploy this ingress controller, which reads the YAML file, the ingress resource that you have created, and it creates the load balancer according to the configuration. If it is confusing, don't worry, I'll explain this using a simple representation. So the first step DevOps engineer does on the Kubernetes cluster is deploy the ingress controller. How will you decide what ingress controller you need? So you can sit with your developers, you can talk with the architect in your organization and understand what load balancing solution does your Kubernetes cluster applications deployed in the Kubernetes cluster need. So these are your pods. Assume you have two pods and you need a load balancing solution to it. Advanced load balancing. You might ask here, Abhishek, I can also do it through a Kubernetes service. Kubernetes service will also provide me load balancing solution, but it only provides you the default load balancing, that is round robin. But when you move to an enterprise, you might need a ratio based load balancing. You might need different kinds of load balancing that are available in the market. For that, a Kubernetes service will not work. So you need a load balancer. Again, we are going to the same point, the advantages of using a load balancer. So to have this load balancer, step one, you create a ingress controller on your Kubernetes cluster. You deploy it onto the namespace that is recommended in the documentation through a Helm chart. And this ingress controller will not do anything unless you create a ingress resource for your Kubernetes application. When you create a ingress resource, the ingress controller will watch the ingress resource, and whatever you wrote in the ingress resource, whatever you wrote in the ingress YAML file, it will convert that into a load balancing configuration. So ingress controller is the one that creates the load balancer for you. Along with the creation, it also configures the load balancer for you. How? Depending upon the ingress configuration that you have provided. So this is very, very important to understand. A lot of people lack this understanding, and people confuse ingress controller with the load balancer. No, ingress controller is never a load balancer. Ingress controller is a simple Go program that is written by the company itself, the load balancing company, such as Traffic has a ingress controller, Kong has a ingress controller, FI has a ingress controller. Lot of companies like Amazon also has an ingress controller for their ALB. So three steps again. Before we go to the demonstration, I want to make sure that everyone understands these three steps. Step one, create the ingress controller, and this ingress controller will watch for the ingress resource, and according to what you have provided in the ingress resource, a load balancer is created and load balancer is configured. Piyush, any questions here?
No, Abhishek, we are good. We are actually I'm what do I say? I'm sure everyone would have understood it the way you have explained. It's pretty clear to me, and it's pretty clear to everyone, I believe. So I guess we can move on to the
Perfect.
demo and we can show what exactly it works behind
Sure.
the scene.
Let's first take a look at a simple Kubernetes Ingress resource, because I've been explaining that when you create a ingress resource, according to your ingress resource, load balancer is created. So let's see what usually is written inside a ingress file. This is a very basic ingress where, just like for every Kubernetes manifest, every Kubernetes resource, you start with the API version. So for ingress, the API group is networking.kx.io and API version is v1. You cannot change this. You have to keep this the same every time. Kind ingress, again, you cannot change this. Metadata, provide the metadata according to your organization standards. We will come to the annotations part. Don't worry about it for now. Spec, this is the crucial part. Whatever you write in the spec and whatever you write in the annotations defines your load balancer and your load balancer configuration. These are the two critical parts. In the spec, always define the ingress class. Again, I'll explain about ingress class in a while. And these are the rules which configures your load balancer. So here in the rule, we are explaining ingress controller that, okay, whoever hits the path, test path, then forward it to the service indirectly to the pods which are associated with the service, right? So you have multiple examples here where you can also do host based routing, you can do path based routing. This is another example where we are telling the load balancer through the ingress controller that create a load balancer for foo.bar.com. If anyone hits your foo.bar.com followed by path/bar, then forward the request to the service indirectly to the pods which are associated with the service. Perfect. So now let's go to our Kubernetes cluster and try to implement a simple ingress configuration. We will create ingress controller, we will create load balancer, and we will see the complete journey of it. So I am on the Kubernetes cluster that is created by Piyush. So we are using the same KubeADM setup. So I have a Flask application for this. You can also refer to the same configuration. Go to the Piyush CKA GitHub repository, look for day 33. you will see everything that I have already cloned. So what we are using is a simple Flask application. If I just go to this, so in the Flask application, um, we are using a app.py, which is a hello world application where I just have hello world, and I'm running this application on the port 80 and on my local host. Now we will take this application, we will containerize this, we will create a deployment for this, we will create a service for this, we will create an ingress for this, and also the setup that we have discussed. First, to containerize, you need a requirements.txt file, which again I have set up. Flask is the basic requirement for this. Okay, so we have the Docker file that I have created. In the Docker file, I am using the Python 3.7 slim image. I'm not using any fancy concepts like uh, multi-stage, because the whole purpose is to just explain the concept of ingress. If you want, you can improvise it. Now, first let's create a container for this. Docker build -t. Let's create a tag for this. Abhishek fi is my Docker username, followed by, let's say, CKA ingress demo. You can use anything, but make sure you provide your Docker username. After this, the image name can be anything, and let's also provide a tag followed by dot, which represents the Docker file in the location. Okay.
Yeah, Abhishek, I guess Docker would not be installed in this machine. So if you want, you can install it.
Okay, let's do that as well. It's good,
Hmm.
people can see it from the basic.
Yep. Yeah, because we were doing the troubleshooting with the help of CRI and I was impersonating how the exam lab terminal would be, because most of the time they won't have Docker install and we have to do the troubleshooting with CRI or just the kubectl commands.
Perfect.
So that's why it's not there.
Perfect, great. So now I have installed Docker. Quite obviously, Docker will not be accessible to the Ubuntu user. So what I can simply do is I can just do sudo user mod -ag docker Ubuntu, where I'm granting the Ubuntu user permissions to the Docker daemon. How am I doing it? I'm adding the Ubuntu user to the Docker group. Now let's see if I can run the same command. If not, we will troubleshoot it. Okay.
I guess there is a typo
Ah,
in build,
okay.
Docker build. Yeah.
Okay. Might be Docker is not started. Let's try to start. Sudo system ctl start Docker. Now let's try again. Okay. Not a problem. Let's log in back to it. There is a reason. Basically, when you are granting permissions to a user, uh, you might. Okay, this is. I need to just go to the ingress folder. So when you are granting permission to a user, to reflect it, you might have to log in back to the user. So it says no such file exists because we are not in the right folder. Perfect. Now we are able to build our Docker image. This is a good part of demo. If there is a beginner, they will also run into same issues, Piyush. So it's good that we also demonstrate the same. Okay, the image is successfully tagged. Now you need to push this image, because by default, when you are creating a Kubernetes deployment, it does not use images from your local machine. So if I simply do Docker images, the image is available here. But the default nature of Kubernetes, when you are creating a Kubernetes deployment, it will try to find the image from your container registry. Unless you specifically mention, there is a policy for it. Let's not go into it. But first, we will push the Docker image. Docker push. I'm trying to push it to my registry. Before that, I need to do a Docker login. So my username is Abhishek F5, and let me enter my password. Okay, login is successful. Now all that I have to do is Docker push the tag that we have created. Perfect. Now the push is also successful. So we have the Python Flask application on my Docker registry. Make sense? Now in the same folder, if you just look for the k8s directory, I have done the heavy lifting for you. I have created the deployment.yaml file. If you cat, oh my bad, if you cat the deployment.yaml file, you have the complete template. Only thing that you have to do is you have to replace the image according to the image name that you have created. So what was the image name? This is the one. Let's go to deployment.yaml. If you already have your application, you don't have to do all this. You don't have to create a deployment, you don't have to create the service. You can start with your ingress, which I am going to do in a while. But we want to do this demo right from the scratch, right from the basics. So that's why we are doing the deployment part as well.
And you can definitely use your own application. You don't have to use this
Yes,
application. If you have any your own application that you are working on, it will be a good practice. You can do all of these things in your own application, and you can proudly say that yes, I have containerized it, I have created deployment, I have deployed the ingress resource, ingress controller, and your application is accessible through ingress. So it will be a good morale boost for you as well. So feel free to use if you want this one or if you have anything else.
perfect, perfect, Piyush. Yeah, so we have created deployment. Now if I just do kubectl get deploy, okay, my hello world, I can also do kubectl get pods. So you can see that basically the hello world application is running. Now what is next step? We need to create a service for this, right? So to create a service, again we have the service.yaml file. So in the service.yaml, what is important? Again, Piyush might have explained in the previous lectures itself. The important thing here is the selector. So what does the selector do? Selector does the service identification, which is a very crucial concept of Kubernetes. If service does not do the service identification, it cannot identify the pods. So this selector should, you can play with your Kubernetes deployments and services YAML manifest, but just make sure the selector that you have provided in the service meets with the label here, the label that you have attached to the pods. So this label I'm talking about, okay, not this label. This is your deployment meta information. So this is the label that gets attached to your Kubernetes pods, and this has to meet with the services that you are creating. Okay, this is meeting my requirement. Label hello world, and in the service, the selector is looking for the label app hello world. So now I will just do kubectl apply -f service.yaml. Okay, now the service is also created. Just for a quick verification, what we can do, kubectl get svc. Okay, I got this service, hello world service. This is my cluster IP address. Let's just curl this.
So actually, we had some technical difficulties due to which we had to stop the recording in between, and now we are recording it again after a day. So thank you once again, Abhishek, for giving us your time once again, and like over to you for the rest of the demo.
Perfect. So we stopped at creation of service. So
Mhm.
we created the service the last day, right? The other day. When we do kubectl get svc, we can see we have our hello world service running. Let's
Mhm.
just verify if the service is able to talk to the pods or not. We discussed
Yeah.
that labels and selector thing, and we
Mhm.
verified the labels and selectors were matching. So service should able to perform the service discovery and identify the right pods. So how to do that? You should first log into your Kubernetes cluster. We are already on the Kubernetes cluster, and just run curl followed by the service IP address. Now, why you need to log into the Kubernetes cluster? Because the service is of type cluster IP. If you cannot access the Kubernetes cluster, you can expose the service in node port type and then probably hit the node port IP using the curl command followed by the node port. Anyways, now I run the curl command, and you can see the output hello world. That means our service discovery is working fine. So before we move to the ingress, make sure you perform this check. Okay, now our pod creation is complete. Our service is also complete. Service is of type cluster IP. We did not want to do node port or the load balancer because we are learning ingress, and we want to perform the ingress routing using the ingress resource itself. So now let's move and look at the ingress.yaml file. So what's inside the ingress.yaml? Again, API version. The API group for ingress is networking.kh.io. It's the API group, followed by the API version, which is v1. Kind is of type resource. Sorry, kind is of type ingress. Then you have the basic metadata. Annotation is important, and within the spec, you have something called as ingress class name. So I'll explain what is this ingress class name. Right now, let's focus on the rules. So what are the rules? We are saying host is example.com. That means if someone hits on the URL example.com followed by this path called slash, then they should be able to access the service hello world followed by the port 80. That means service on port 80. Now when you create the ingress resource, nothing would happen actually unless and until you deploy the ingress controller. What I mean by that, I explained that in the theory part. Let's take a look at in the practical as well. So now kubectl apply -f ingress.yaml, right? Uh, kubectl get ingress. So if you see here, observe carefully, the address is not assigned yet. Why is that? Because you have created the ingress resource. Nobody is watching this ingress resource. As I've explained in the theory part, if I show that one more time, you know, you have an ingress resource that you have created. End of the day, you need a load balancer that is routing the request to your pods. But who is doing this part for you? We need to deploy a ingress controller. So now the ingress controller is the one that is responsible for watching the ingress resource and creating the load balancer for you. Let's pick up a popular ingress controller. You have lot of ingress controllers in the market. For this video, let's choose the basic one, that is Nginx ingress controller. What are the alternatives? You have Traffic, you have Ambassador, you have Kong, you have Fi, you have a lot of ingress controllers that are available in the market. Okay, now for us to choose the Nginx ingress controller, first let's go to the documentation, Kubernetes. Let's search for Nginx ingress controller. So, Piyush, there is a story here that I have to
Mm-hmm.
explain.
Yep.
So, Nginx ingress controllers, you have two Nginx ingress controllers in the market. Okay. So, why is that? So, Kubernetes community, they have developed a Nginx ingress controller because
Mm-hmm.
Nginx is an open source one. Initially,
Yep.
when they were creating the ingress controllers, they came up with the Nginx ingress controller. Now there
Mm-hmm.
is the company called Nginx. They also have developed their own ingress controller. So you have to
Okay.
be careful. If you go to this documentation, you will go to the Nginx ingress controller that is developed by Nginx, now owned by Fi.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you go to this documentation, you will go to the ingress controller that is developed by the Kubernetes community. Of course,
Correct.
both of them works fine, but let's use the open source one itself.
Okay.
So
And I believe in the exam sandbox, if there is a task for ingress, this ingress controller would already be installed.
yes,
Yeah.
ingress controller would be installed on the cluster that you have. Uh,
Hmm.
it has been some good time I have given that exam, Piyush. But when I gave last
Okay.
time, the ingress controller was there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So go to this part, getting started with the
Hmm.
documentation. Now what we have to do, we need to install the Nginx ingress controller, right? So they have
Correct.
provided different options for us. Where
Hmm.
you want to install? Do you want to install on Minikube, Rancher, AWS? So
Hmm.
we want to do it on the AWS.
Okay.
So here again, you have multiple options. In AWS, we use the network load balancer to expose Nginx ingress controller behind a service
Hmm.
of type load balancer. So we have the manifest here. Let's just copy, paste it here.
Okay.
If you are interested, and I will highly recommend also, go and see what is each of this resource doing. So
Correct.
whenever you deploy something on Kubernetes, see, a lot of things
Hmm.
are available for you in the documentation, but if you spend some time, understand what exactly is the service account doing here, what exactly is
Hmm.
the role doing, cluster role, right? Why they
Correct.
have created all of these resources, including
Yeah.
some admission
That
controller.
correct. There, that would be a good learning experience for everyone. So yes, I would also recommend doing that. And by this video, we have covered almost all of these objects: service accounts, RBAC, cluster role bindings, config map, services, deployment, jobs. We have covered everything except validating admission webhook. But you can have a read at that, and you will be able to understand it, but
Perfect.
rest of them we have already completed. And yes, please feel free to do that. Yeah.
Perfect. Then it's awesome. So now our ingress resource should be identified automatically. Why?
Mm-hmm.
So again, if you go to the ingress, so you can see something called as ingress class name. So this is very, very important. This was not there before. When I started with Kubernetes, ingress class name did not exist. But now ingress class name is very important because in a Kubernetes cluster, you might be working on a Kubernetes cluster, and on the Kubernetes clusters, you have multiple development teams. Let's say multiple namespaces, and you know, couple of development teams, they need Kong ingress controller, and one team might need Nginx ingress controller. This is a very common scenario. Depending upon
Mm-hmm.
the requirements the load balancer provide, development teams might choose ingress controllers. So they might come up with a requirement that, hey DevOps guys, please install Kong as well as Nginx Ingress controllers, both of them. Now you have created an Ingress resource. By default, these Ingress controllers will watch for the Ingress resource. Now what if
Mm-hmm.
Kong will also perform the Ingress for you, and Nginx will also perform the Ingress logic for you? So you
Okay.
will run into some race condition, your cluster,
Right.
the Ingress routing, there might be some
Mm-hmm.
issues. So that's
Mm-hmm.
why what Kubernetes community has introduced is an spec field called as Ingress class name. Now, if you provide the Ingress class name as Nginx, then Nginx controller will be watching for the Ingress resource. We can
Okay.
also see that here. If you just do kubectl get pods minus a grep Nginx, I'm just searching for the Nginx Ingress controller pod name. Let
Mm-hmm.
me open this for you. Kubectl edit pod minus n ingress nginx. You can see when this ingress controller is starting, in the command arguments of this ingress controller, ingress class name is equals to nginx. That
Okay.
means this ingress controller is already told, if the ingress class name is nginx, only then you have to watch for the ingress resources.
Okay.
Perfect. So
Mm-hmm.
this is very important. Again, I'm saying if you don't mention the ingress class name, you might mess up the complete ingress configuration and it will be difficult to troubleshoot.
Okay.
Okay. Now let's see kubectl get ingress. Okay. The address is not populated yet. Let's see in the logs if there is any issue. Let's replace the edit command that we have. Now what I'm doing, I am troubleshooting and I'm trying to understand if the ingress controller. So we can see here very clearly that the ingress resource is read by the ingress controller. So it clearly says found valid ingress class. Default hello world ingress class name is nginx. So this is our ingress resource, right? Which is in the default namespace. So now let me see again kubectl get ing. Okay. Still the address is not populated. If you can guess why is this happening, this is happening because the cloud controller manager does not exist on this Kubernetes cluster. So this is a Kubernetes cluster that is created using kubeadm and on the AWS EC2 instances. So obviously Piyush might not have installed the cloud controller manager component. So that is the reason why the address is not getting populated. If you know about the cloud controller manager, what it basically does is it will look for the services of type load balancer. Kubectl get svc minus n ingress nginx. So this is actually the service that is created for the nginx ingress controller. And if you see the type of the service, it is of type load balancer and the external IP is still pending. Now, this is how we need to understand. Now, when you look at the external IP is pending, why must the external IP be pending? Because the cloud controller manager might not exist. Right, Piyush?
Yep. That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Now, what we can do? Either we can stop the video here or we can try a workaround where I will simply change the service of type from load balancer to node port. Now, if you are trying the same demo on an EKS cluster, you don't have to do anything extra. It will work as is. Okay, let's edit this service. kubectl edit. Which service are we editing? We are editing the ingress controller service so that the ingress controller service will get a node port and then it will start working After that, it will also assign a IP address for our ingress resource. You can see that in a couple of minutes. Okay, let's go to the bottom of the file and just change the type load balancer to type node port. Okay, now I have changed this particular thing. Let's verify the service. Perfect, service is changed to type node
Mhm.
port. Now what I will do is kubectl get ing. Let me just delete the ingress resource and create one more time. So
Okay.
delete, and let me apply the configuration back. This is required because you have recreated the ingress controller. Some ingress controllers are capable of doing this as well, where they can watch for the ingress resources that are already existing and where the configuration was earlier applied.
Mhm.
Kubectl get ing. Okay, it's still taking some time. Let's look at the logs of this. Okay, perfect. Kubectl get ing. I mean, this takes some time, right? Perfect.
Yep.
Now
Okay.
the IP address is populated. Now don't think that the IP address is not getting populated, because the ingress controller, it's a Golang program, right? It will take some time. It has to look for all the ingress resources on the cluster. It needs to
Mhm.
populate the IP address. So now you got the IP address. If I try to use this IP address, and if I try to hit this IP address, I need to access the pods. So the ingress should work. Previously,
Yep.
we tried from the service IP address. Piyush, if you remember, when we
Mhm.
created the service,
Yep.
we hit
Yep.
on the service IP address and it
Yep.
hit the pods. Now, what I'm
Correct.
going to do is I will access the ingress IP address, and
Mhm.
it has to send the request to my pods.
Okay.
Here, I need to explain one thing. If you go to the ingress.yaml, what we told the load balancer, we told the load balancer that anyone who hits on the example.com, then the request has to go to the service and on the port. So
Correct.
anything else, load balancer will not accept your request.
Mhm.
So now if I
So
just try
earlier,
to do,
yeah,
sorry,
just would like to mention over here. So earlier when we were hitting the service, so we were doing a curl on service, and then service has the backend, which is the deployment or the pod, and it will redirect the request to that. Now we have added one more layer on top of service, which is ingress. So you will actually now hit the ingress because your service was not externally exposed, but your ingress is. So
yes,
you will now hit the ingress. Ingress will redirect the traffic to service, as Abhishek just mentioned over here. So service will, um, and then service will be called as per the rules that have specified in the YAML,
perfect.
and then it will again call the pod. So it just we have added another load balancer on top of service.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
please
this is
go
the
ahead.
load balancer IP address that got
Mhm,
generated for us. And
mhm.
now if I hit directly on the load balancer IP address, curl followed by the load balancer, you will see 404 not found. And this
Yep.
is very important to understand again. Why are you getting not found? You are hitting the load balancer, you are hitting the actual load balancer, but still you are
Mhm,
getting not found. Why? Because in the ingress configuration, you told the load balancer through the ingress controller that only accept the request on the example.com.
mhm.
So now what I need to do is somehow I have to resolve example.com to the load balancer IP address. If you want to do it on your laptop, what you need to do, you need to go and update your etc host configuration. Okay, uh, Piyush has provided that in the assignment as well. Now what I
Yep.
will do is, using the curl command, I'm not updating the etc host because that is your assignment. Now using the curl command, I will show how to map a IP address to a host. So for that, what I will do is I will use this curl command, where I will actually hit on the example.com, but I will resolve the example.com to the IP address that is provided here. Of course, you can see example.com port 80 followed by the IP address. This is exactly same as updating etc host on your local machine. Let's hit this. Perfect. I can see the hello world.
Awesome.
So that means our ingress configuration is working fine. Now take
Correct.
back this same thing, and instead of using the curl command directly on the master of your Kubernetes cluster on your laptop, just use the example.com, and instead of this IP address, you need to use the node port of your EC2 instance.
Correct. So uh, the thing that I would like to mention over here, so you must be wondering that we don't have the domain example.com. How are we even using it? Right? Because you see, we are mapping the host name with the IP address locally, and which is same as creating an A record, right? And which we have already seen in the DNS video where Piyush, the other Piyush, not me, the Piyush showed you how to map the entry, how to create the entry internally in the etc resolve file, sorry, etc host file, and how do we do that from the DNS management system as well through Cloudflare or through any other DNS provider. So this is same as adding the entry in that file and what Abhishek just showed over here. So over here, make sure you understand this particular line and make sure you complete the assignment, because in the assignment you will actually be updating that file and you will actually be see the result. So this assignment is not just for ingress, this will be a combination of ingress, service, as well as DNS.
Yeah.
So yeah, please attempt it, and you know how to reach out if you face any issues.
One more
Yeah,
thing,
please.
one common mistake people do is they will provide the same IP address in the etc host. It will not work because this is the IP address that I am accessing from the Kubernetes cluster. What you need to provide is the node port,
Yep.
right? Provide the node port, then you will be able to access.
Okay. So node port as in on which the node is listening to.
Yes,
Node IP
node
address,
IP
right?
address.
Okay.
My bad. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, cool. And there is one more thing. Like I we shouldn't have given so many hints, but yeah, I mean it was a long video and there was too much to understand. So I guess it is fair to provide the details. So you see, we will be accessing this server um, on port 80, right? But we did not expose port 80 in any of our nodes. So make sure you add the entry in your security groups to allow incoming traffic on port 80 on these nodes on which the service is listening to. Okay.
Thank you so much, Piyush, for
No,
having me.
thanks to you. Thanks to you, Abhishek. It was a wonderful session, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of learning for everyone. And Ingress, which was like a buzzword for everyone, and it is just like a piece of cake for everyone. I'm pretty sure about that. So thank you so much, guys. If you have any questions for us, feel free to comment, and we'll try to answer. And if you need any help, any assistance, we have a Discord server. There is a wonderful community over there who is ready to help you, so please utilize that opportunity. And from my side as well, say as much as thanks to Abhishek if you can. I would really appreciate that. Thank you so much, Abhishek.
Take care. Bye bye.
Thanks, bye.